The sunken temple had not seen a royal visitor in 4 generations, and Elin liked it that way, because an unvisited ruin left more room for the kind of quiet, careful work that mattered to no one but her. She climbed the broken outer steps every morning before the town below had fully woken, past ivy-choked columns and collapsed archways that had once framed something grand enough to matter, until she reached the inner chamber, where the great stone dragon slept, curled protectively around itself, the way it had for longer than any historian could confidently date. Everyone in the region called it a statue, and Elin had called it that too, once, before 3 years of dusting the same enormous scales taught her hands things her mind had been slow to accept. Statues did not radiate a faint, persistent warmth on cold mornings the way this one did, low and constant beneath stone that should have been as cold as any other rock in the ruin. Statues did not have eyes closed in a way that looked, on certain mornings, less like carved stillness, and less like death, and more like patient, deliberate sleep. She was 28, the last in a line of relic keepers her family had provided to this crumbling temple for 6 generations, a duty nobody in the capital remembered funding anymore, and nobody in her family had ever seriously questioned continuing. Her father had done the work before her. His mother had done it before him. Elin had grown up believing, the way children believe the shapes of their own inherited lives, that dusting an ancient dragon statue nobody else cared about was simply what people in her family did, and she had never once resented the quiet, patient rhythm of it. The town below sent up a handful of curious visitors every few years, usually scholars chasing some fragment of old imperial history, and Elin had learned to answer their questions with the same careful, practiced patience her father had taught her, offering just enough truth to satisfy their curiosity, without ever revealing the small, private details 3 years of daily proximity had taught her that no outside record had ever documented. The warmth beneath the stone was one such detail. The way the dragon's closed eyes seemed to track the light differently depending on the season was another. She kept both to herself, the way 6 generations before her apparently had. I think it is worth saying, at the start of this, that Elin never touched the statue carelessly. 6 generations of relic keepers had left behind careful instructions about which sections of scale could be cleaned, and which were considered too old and too brittle to risk. And Elin had followed those instructions faithfully for 3 years without deviation, running her cloth along the same familiar path across the dragon's flank, every single morning, without once reaching for the one section every relic keeper before her had been warned, for reasons nobody could fully explain, to leave entirely alone. Her father had told her once, in the last winter before his death, that he had come close to touching the marked scale himself as a young man, curiosity briefly overpowering discipline the way it sometimes did in the young, and that something in the dragon's stone stillness had seemed to shift the instant his hand drew near, enough to send him stepping back without ever quite understanding why. He had never spoken of the moment again after that single confession, and Elin had filed it away with the rest of her family's careful, half-explained inheritance, one more small mystery in a life built almost entirely out of them. The warning had been passed down through 6 generations, exactly as it had first been written, copied faithfully from one relic keeper's private journal to the next. Do not touch the scale beneath the dragon's left foreleg, the one marked with a spiral pattern unlike any other on its body. No explanation accompanied the instruction in any of the journals Elin had inherited, only the same careful warning repeated across 2 centuries of handwriting, and Elin had followed it the way she followed every instruction in those journals, out of respect for the work, rather than any real fear of what breaking it might cause. She had wondered about the marked scale more than she let herself admit, particularly on the long, solitary mornings when the temple held nothing but her own breathing and the faint stone warmth radiating up from beneath her cloth. The spiral pattern sat slightly apart from the dragon's other scales, subtly different in texture, in a way her fingers had noticed even through careful gloves, and more than once she had let her hand hover near it before pulling back, mindful of 6 generations of caution she had no real evidence to dismiss. Elin did not know, because no journal in her family's careful records had ever recorded it, that the marked scale was not decoration at all, but the exact point of an ancient binding ritual. the single place on the dragon's entire body where a bond could be renewed by a touch freely given rather than taken. The ritual had been performed once, centuries earlier, by the Empire's first emperor and the dragon who would come to be called Auren, and it had gone dormant the moment that first emperor died, waiting through 200 years of quiet stone sleep for a second touch that met the ritual's very particular, very old conditions. Far to the south, in the capital's palace, Emperor Roan had spent the whole of his 9-year reign trying and failing to complete a version of that same binding himself, drawn by an old family conviction that his bloodline carried a dormant connection to the ancient dragon nobody living had seen wake in 2 centuries. He had visited 3 ruins in as many years, including once, briefly, the sunken temple itself, and had left each time with nothing to show for the attempt, but a growing, private suspicion that royal blood alone had never been what the old bond required. He had not told his council the full truth of those failed visits, allowing them to believe instead that matters of state had simply kept him too occupied for a serious attempt, because admitting that an emperor had knelt before a sleeping statue 3 separate times and felt nothing in return was a vulnerability he was not yet willing to hand to advisors who already questioned enough about his fitness to rule. He carried the disappointment privately instead, the way he carried most things, and told himself each time that the next ruin, the next attempt, might finally be the one that worked. The morning it happened began exactly like every other morning of the last 3 years, Elin climbing the broken outer steps in the gray half-light before sunrise, her cloth and her small kit of careful tools tucked under one arm, her mind already drifting toward the ordinary list of tasks the day's cleaning would require. She had slept poorly the night before, troubled by a dream she could not fully remember, except for a persistent, wordless sense of being watched by something very old and very patient, and she told herself, climbing the last of the steps, that the dream meant nothing beyond a restless night. She began her work the way she always began it, starting at the dragon's tail and working methodically forward along the familiar path her family's careful instructions had mapped out generations before her, and for the better part of an hour the morning proceeded with nothing unusual in it at all. The temple held its usual silence. The dragon held its usual stillness. Ellen's hands moved through their usual practiced rhythm, and if she had not been tired, if the dream had not left her thoughts looser than their normal careful discipline, she might never have let her hand drift as far as it did. She noticed, in the vague, distracted way, exhaustion allows a person to notice things without fully processing them, that the chamber felt warmer that morning than usual, and that the low, familiar stone warmth she had grown so used to over 3 years seemed to be pulsing faintly beneath her palms, in a rhythm that almost matched her own tired heartbeat. She told herself it was simply the early sun finally reaching the chamber's high windows. She did not stop to consider, until it was already far too late to reconsider anything, that the warmth might have been responding to her presence rather than the season. It happened without any real decision behind it, the way accidents happen, her cloth slipping slightly off its intended path as she reached to clean a section just beside the marked spiral scale, her bare fingers, gloves forgotten in her exhaustion, brushing directly against the one place 6 generations of warnings had told her never to touch. The temple went silent in a way it had never gone silent before, a silence with weight and pressure behind it, and Ellen felt something surge up through her fingers into her arm that had nothing to do with the cold stone morning around her, a warmth so sudden and so total that she gasped aloud and stumbled back from the statue with her whole body shaking. Her ears rang with a pressure she could not explain, and for one disorienting moment the whole chamber seemed to tilt around her, the familiar ruined columns and cracked floor swimming out of focus before slowly settling back into place. She pressed her tingling hand against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, and stared at the statue for any sign that something had genuinely changed, rather than some trick of her own exhausted mind. The stone beneath the marked scale had darkened faintly, she realized, a shift so subtle she might have missed it on any other morning, and her stomach dropped with the sudden, certain knowledge that whatever had just happened was not something a poor night's sleep could explain away. 300 miles south, In the middle of a routine council session that had occupied his full attention moments before, Emperor Roan went rigid in his chair, as though something enormous and wordless had struck him directly through the chest, a sensation of ancient, overwhelming recognition that stole the breath clean out of his lungs and sent him staggering upright hard enough to knock his own chair backward across the polished floor. His advisors surged toward him in alarm, certain he had been struck by illness or poison, and Roan waved them back with a hand that would not stop trembling, too stunned by what he had just felt to explain it to anyone yet. Something woke, he managed finally, his voice unsteady in a way none of his advisors had ever heard from him before. I felt it. I felt it the way you feel your own heartbeat, sudden and enormous and entirely outside my body, and I have spent 9 years trying to feel exactly that sensation on purpose and failing every single time. He pressed a hand flat against his own chest, still feeling the echo of whatever had surged through the imperial bloodline's old connection to a bond he had never managed to complete himself, and understood, with a certainty that startled him more than the sensation itself had, that someone else had just succeeded where he had spent 9 years failing. He called for his fastest riders within the hour, dispatching them toward every ruin his family's old records connected to the ancient dragon bond, the sunken temple foremost among them given its proximity to the surge's apparent origin. His advisors argued, as they always did, for caution and process and a measured response befitting an emperor's dignity, and Roan, for the first time in 9 careful years of rule, dismissed every one of their objections and rode out himself before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. I do not think Roan fully understood, riding hard toward a ruin he had visited once already without success, what exactly he expected to find there. He understood only the echo still resonating through his chest, unmistakable and enormous, and a certainty that whatever had caused it deserved to be met by the Emperor himself rather than a company of riders sent in his place. His council had watched him leave the capital with open alarm, several of them insisting an emperor riding out alone at such speed represented an unacceptable risk to imperial stability, and Roan had listened to every objection without slowing his preparations even slightly. 9 years of careful, measured rule had taught him exactly when caution served the empire and when it simply served his own comfort, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he trusted his own certainty over the accumulated wisdom of every advisor telling him to wait. Elin backed away from the statue until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the far wall, staring at the dragon with a mixture of terror and disbelief that made her whole body feel numb, and watched, unable to look away, as the ancient stillness she had dusted every morning for 3 years began, slowly and with a sound like grinding rock settling after centuries of sleep, to move. The eyes she had once described to herself as merely dragon-shaped opened fully for the first time in longer than any record could confirm, revealing depths of gold that seemed to hold centuries inside them. Auren's first movement was small, a single foreleg flexing against stone floor that cracked slightly beneath the pressure of a weight that had not shifted in 200 years, and the sound it made echoed through the temple's ruined chambers, like something ancient reasserting itself into a world that had long since stopped expecting it to. Elin pressed herself harder against the wall, every instinct screaming at her to run, and found, beneath the terror, a thread of something else entirely, a wordless certainty that whatever was waking in front of her meant her no harm at all. I don't understand what I've done, she said aloud, her voice thin and shaking in the vast stone chamber, and Auren's great head turned toward the sound of it with a slow, deliberate weight, gold eyes fixing on Elin with an attention that felt, despite the terror still gripping her chest, unmistakably gentle. The dragon made no move toward her. It simply held that gaze, patient in a way that reminded Elin, absurdly, of the patient stillness she herself had brought to 3 years of careful, quiet work in this very chamber. You have done exactly what 6 generations of my keepers were waiting for someone to finally do, Auren said, and the voice that filled the chamber was low and resonant and entirely unexpected, a voice Elin had never once imagined the statue capable of producing, in 3 years of speaking to it without ever expecting an answer. I have been waiting a very long time for a touch given freely rather than taken by force. I did not expect it from the hands that have cared for me so carefully every morning for the last 3 years. Though I confess, looking back, I should have. Elin stared up at the fully awakened dragon, still too stunned to fully trust her own legs beneath her, and found herself noticing small details that felt suddenly urgent to memorize. The particular deep gold of Auren's eyes, the way its enormous voice seemed to vibrate through the stone floor beneath her, rather than simply through the air around her. 3 years of speaking quietly to a statue she had never expected to answer had not prepared her, in any real way, for the disorienting reality of being answered at last. Auren explained, slowly, and with the patience of something that had genuinely never been in a hurry, what 6 generations of relic keepers had preserved without ever fully understanding. That the marked scale beneath its foreleg was the single point of an ancient binding ritual performed once by the Empire's first emperor, and that the bond had gone dormant, not from any failure of blood, but because the ritual required something blood alone could never guarantee, a touch offered without any expectation of reward, given purely out of the kind of care that asked nothing back. Every emperor since has come to this temple hoping royal blood would be enough, Auren said, lowering its enormous head until it rested closer to Elin's height, an unmistakable gesture of trust from a creature that could have crushed her without effort. None of them understood that the bond was never about blood at all. It was about care freely given, the kind that tends something for its own sake rather than for what it might return. You have tended me faithfully for 3 years without once expecting anything back for it. That, it turns out, was always the only key that mattered. Elin sank slowly down the wall until she was sitting on the cold stone floor, overwhelmed by the scale of what she had apparently done without ever intending to do it, and found herself laughing, unsteady and disbelieving, at the strange absurdity of an accident 3 years of careful discipline had somehow still led her toward. I touched it because I was tired, she admitted. That's the whole truth of it. I was tired and careless for exactly 1 moment after 3 years of never once being either. Sometimes the truest things happen exactly that way, Auren said, something like warmth threading through its ancient voice. Deliberate effort chases this kind of bond away, more often than it earns it. I do not think it is any accident that the hands finally capable of waking me were the ones too honestly exhausted to perform for anyone, including themselves. Elin absorbed that thought in silence, still trying to steady her racing heart, when the sound of approaching riders echoed up from the broken steps outside the chamber. Auren lifted its head at the sound, unbothered, already seeming to know exactly who approached before the first rider had cleared the outer stairs, and shifted its great body slightly closer around Elin, in a gesture she would later understand as protective rather than possessive. You do not need to be afraid of who is coming, it told her, low and certain. He has been waiting 9 years for this moment, though I doubt even he fully understands yet what he is walking into. Roan reached the sunken temple ahead of his own riders, having pushed his horse harder than any careful emperor should, across 300 miles of open road, and took the broken outer steps 2 at a time, with a desperation that stripped away every trace of royal composure his advisors had spent years cultivating in him. He burst into the inner chamber breathless and travel-worn, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight that met him. The ancient stone dragon he had visited once before in failure, now fully awake, curled with unmistakable protectiveness around a woman sitting calm and stunned on the chamber floor. You felt it, Elin said, before Roan had found any words of his own, some instinct telling her exactly who this travel-worn stranger had to be, even before introductions were offered. Roan nodded, still catching his breath, his eyes moving between the woman and the fully awakened dragon, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a relief so total it looked almost like grief. I felt it from the council chamber, he confirmed. 300 miles away, and it went through me like nothing I have ever experienced in 9 years of trying to feel exactly that. Auren lifted its great head to regard the Emperor with an expression Elin was already learning to read as genuine warmth beneath the ancient formality of its bearing. You came yourself, Auren observed, rather than sending riders to collect what your blood could not earn on its own. That, Emperor Roan, tells me a great deal about the kind of ruler your reign has actually made of you." Roan's jaw tightened slightly at the observation, though he did not argue with it, crossing the chamber slowly, instead to stand a respectful distance from both the dragon and the woman it had so plainly chosen to protect. "I am not here to take anything from either of you," he said, quiet and careful, addressing them both together. "I rode 300 miles because I needed to understand, with my own eyes, what had finally succeeded where 9 years of my own effort failed. I did not come to claim a bond that was never mine to claim in the first place." His riders arrived moments later, spilling into the chamber with weapons half drawn out of pure reflexive caution, before the sight of Auren's calm, protective posture around Elin made them stand down almost as quickly. Roan waved them back toward the outer steps without turning from the conversation, giving the chamber the same quiet he could tell. Instinctively, both Elin and the newly woken dragon needed far more than they needed an audience of armed strangers crowding in around them. Auren settled slightly at Roan's words, some tension easing from its ancient posture, and turned its attention back to Elin, with a consideration that made clear the dragon intended to let her, and not the Emperor, decide what came next. "The bond is yours," Auren told her plainly. "It formed the moment you touched the marked scale, and nothing about that changes simply because an emperor has now arrived to witness it. What you choose to do with it, whether you wish to ride, to stay, to walk away from this temple entirely, and leave me sleeping again, is a decision that belongs only to you." Elin considered the enormity of that offer in silence for a long moment, looking between the ancient dragon that had slept beneath her careful hands for 3 years, and the travel-worn emperor watching her with an expression that held none of the entitlement she might reasonably have expected from a man whose bloodline had chased this exact bond for generations. "I don't want to walk away," she said finally, surprising herself with how certain the words came out. "I have spent 3 years caring for something I believed was only stone. I am not going to abandon it, now that I know it was never stone at all." Roan's shoulders dropped with visible relief at her answer, though Elin noticed he was careful not to let that relief tip into anything that resembled a claim on the outcome. "The temple will need proper support now," he said instead, practical and measured. "Riders, supplies, scholars who can help both of you understand a bond that has not existed in this form for 2 centuries. I can provide all of that without asking anything from you in return beyond permission to send it. And if I wanted more than supplies," Elin said, watching him carefully, testing the shape of an honesty she had not expected to reach for so soon, "would that be something you were prepared to offer as freely as everything else you've just listed?" Roan met her gaze steadily, something unguarded moving across his travel-worn face for the first time since he had entered the chamber. "I rode 300 miles the moment I felt this bond wake," he said, quiet. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Elin, even if neither of us has said it plainly yet." Auren made a low, satisfied sound somewhere behind them both, the unmistakable sound of a very old, very patient creature watching something unfold exactly the way it had hoped it might, and neither Elin nor Roan fully managed to hide their embarrassment at being so plainly observed in the middle of a moment neither of them had expected to reach quite this quickly. Elin found, despite the heat rising in her face, that she did not particularly want to take the honesty back. Roan stayed at the sunken temple far longer than his advisors expected or entirely approved of, delaying his return to the capital by first days and then weeks, occupying himself with the practical work of arranging support for the temple while spending every spare hour in the inner chamber learning, alongside Elin, exactly what it meant to exist near a bond neither of them had been prepared for. Auren watched the slow, careful courtship unfolding beneath its ancient gaze, with visible patience, occasionally offering an observation neither of them had quite worked up the courage to say aloud themselves. "You clean the same scale near my foreleg every morning that you touched by accident 3 years into this arrangement," Auren remarked to Elin one dusty afternoon, watching her work with the same careful attention it had always shown her. "And you," it said, turning its great head toward Roan, who had taken to visiting the chamber at exactly the hour Elin did her morning cleaning, "have found remarkably many practical reasons to be present for that particular hour every single day this month." Neither of them had a good answer for the observation, and Auren seemed entirely satisfied by their combined, flustered silence. Elin found, over those weeks, that Roan was nothing like the entitled bloodline chasing a legacy she had half expected before meeting him. He asked careful questions about her family's 6 generations of quiet service, and listened to the answers with genuine interest, rather than polite patience. He brought scholars from the capital not to study the bond for his own benefit, but to help Elin understand a role that had been thrust on her without warning, and he never once, in all those weeks, suggested that her staying at the temple should be contingent on anything beyond her own choice to remain there. "I keep waiting for you to ask something of me," she admitted to him one evening, the two of them sitting on the temple's broken outer steps, while Auren dozed contentedly in the chamber behind them. "A demand, a condition, something that makes this feel like the kind of arrangement my family always warned me the capital eventually asks for." Roan was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset color the ruined columns gold. "I learned a long time ago," he said finally, "that the things worth having are rarely the things you can demand into existence. I would rather wait for you to offer than ask for anything at all." Elin turned that answer over in the quiet that followed, watching the last color drain slowly out of the sky above the ruined columns, and felt something in her chest settle that had been unsettled since the morning her tired hands first brushed against the marked scale. She had spent 3 years caring for something without ever expecting recognition for it. She was only beginning to understand what it meant to have that same quality of patience offered back to her in return, freely, by a man who could have simply taken what his bloodline had chased for generations, and chose, instead, to wait for her to want it too. The formal ceremony recognizing the bond's return took place at the temple itself rather than the capital, a decision Roan insisted on over his advisor's objections, arguing that a bond born of quiet, unglamorous devotion deserved to be honored in the place where that devotion had actually happened, rather than in a palace hall that had never once cared for the dragon at the center of it. Elin stood before the small, gathered crowd of scholars and writers in her ordinary work clothes rather than anything grander, and found she preferred it that way entirely. "I have thought a great deal, these last weeks, about what actually woke this bond after 2 centuries of silence," she told the gathered crowd, Auren curled protectively behind her, and Roan standing close at her side. "It was not royal blood, it was not ambition or effort, or 9 years of trying very hard to earn something through force of will alone. It was 3 years of ordinary, unremarkable care, given without any expectation of ever being noticed, let alone rewarded. I have read a line from the writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, that it is only with the heart that one can see rightly, that what is essential is invisible to the eye, and I think of Elin dusting a statue every morning for 3 years, without ever once suspecting what slept beneath her careful hands. She could not see what was essential in that dragon, she simply tended it anyway, faithfully, the way her family had for 6 generations before her, and the essential thing woke for her precisely because she had never gone looking for it. Roan took her hand as the small ceremony closed, the marked scale on Auren's flank catching the last of the day's light behind them both, and Elin understood, standing on the same broken steps she had climbed alone every morning for 3 quiet years, that the life waiting for her now would never again be quite so solitary, and that she would not have traded a single one of those solitary mornings for anything, because they had been the exact and only path that led her here. Auren remained curled protectively behind them both, as the small crowd dispersed back down the broken outer steps, watching the two of them with the particular contentment of something ancient, finally settled after 2 centuries of patient, dormant waiting, and Elin found herself reaching back to rest one hand against the marked scale, one final time that evening, not out of duty this time, but simply because she wanted to,